There was an incredible build-up of optimism ahead of Copenhagen, and it was difficult coming away not to feel, I guess, disappointed and a little bit confused about what exactly had been achieved, with almost more commentary on who was to blame than actually what the implications were for us all going forward.
What struck me most, Alan, was the level of business engagement. I was at the business day with over 1,000 business representatives. The panel featured, I would say, 7 to 8 Fortune 500 chief executives and many other executives. And I've never seen such a business involvement. In the past, I've seen UN meetings where literally business had 5 minutes of airtime during a 3-day summit.
It was great to see the level of business activity and involvement at the conference, although the risk then is that just increases the level of disappointment if not enough actually came out of the event.
It's not hard to point out the shortcomings, but there are also some major achievements. One, I would say, the science for the first time was undisputed. It was widely recognized. Climate change is real and it's man-made. And for the first time we had the objective to keep the rise in temperature below 2 centigrades. For the first time we saw developed countries, US, and developing countries, China, being involved in the discussion. And also we saw for the first time that the developed countries jointly committed to $100 billion by 2020 annually to support the developing countries. So I would say it's fair that, yes, although we see shortcomings, no clear targets, no timelines, no legally binding treaty, but also a couple of breakthroughs and major achievements.
I think you're absolutely right that this is part of a process and there were some real movements forward. But I guess some of the targets that were set by certain countries were both
quite
ahead
impressive.
And during this
Yes,
were pretty dramatic.
Yes. No, absolutely. I mean, Japan and Europe and some other countries already had quite ambitious targets. The European Union, 2020, Japan, 25%. But let's go back to those two major economies. The US for the first time, proposed emission reductions. So they proposed 70% emission reductions by 2005 levels in 2020, all the way up to 83% emission reductions by 2050. If you look at China always opposed targets while being in the process of development. And for the first time, they agreed to have those targets, 40 to 45% decrease of carbon intensity. I mean, that's quite significant.
These are huge reductions, 83% in the US, and even if you're a little bit cynical about the timeline, this is going to happen. Maybe for me there's a parallel to the financial crisis. There were some institutions ahead of the crisis who maybe they didn't quite see what was going to come, but they saw the need to be ready for change. And with climate change, almost the longer we take before we respond, then when the tipping point comes, the more significant the change will be for the world and for business. And I can see organisations right now who are planning for the future and are going to win through this versus a competition, both in terms of reacting to the cost pressures, regulations, but actually getting out in front and seeing business opportunities as well as just cost and issues to deal with.
I do see some similarities with the financial crisis, like you pointed out. And I think if you look at it with Copenhagen, you have to distinguish between the low-hanging fruit, which is there. Stuff that businesses could have done yesterday, such as energy reduction and energy efficiency. They both drive out cost and carbon. And yes, there's also the hard stuff, like regionalization of logistics, getting from globalized production to regionalized production. Those emission reductions which will never happen unless we see rising in energy prices, unless we see a price on carbon or regulation will kick in. The more interesting is the middle ground. That's where companies have to manage the paradoxes and the dilemmas. I think that's very interesting. An example from the shipping industry, this slow steaming, where the shipping companies talk to the shippers and have these vessels operate at a lower speed. There are some trade-offs between speed and flexibility, and again, fuel cost and CO2 reduction. Surprisingly, if you discuss these things with your clients, you end up with some interesting examples where you might get a little bit of more time, but really save 30 up to 40% on the fuel costs and the CO2.
So in summary, although perhaps inevitably Copenhagen disappointed a little, what's clear now is that there will be real activity coming from governments. No one's arguing about the science. Some very challenging targets being set, as you say, by the two most important economies. and the opportunity now for business to be looking right ahead, making some significant changes, recognising what will come in time from government and being ready to capitalise on the opportunity as well as protecting themselves from cost and regulation. So the question now for me is, what's next in this incredible process? We're all off to Mexico, and what's our expectation going to be?
As for Mexico, I think it's very hard to predict how it will play out. Obviously, there's still lots of discussions and issues to be resolved. Well, personally, I believe we will see a legally binding treaty for reducing global emissions in Mexico, which will set us further on a road to low-carbon economy.